Imagine Rome in its grandeur, a city of opulence and ambition. Now picture a boy, not just any boy, but Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known affectionately as Little Boots or Caligula, a name that would echo through history with infamy. We plunge into the heart of Rome's complex world, where emperors wield near-divine power and spectacle captivates the masses. Before the chaos, before the whispered tales of cruelty and madness, there was a young Gaius, nicknamed Little Boots by adoring legionaries for his childhood marches in miniature soldier sandals, a tender moniker that belied the dark legend he would become. Born into the intricate web of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, he was the son of Germanicus, a celebrated war hero, and Agrippina the Elder, a woman of fierce resolve. His early years were steeped in political intrigue, his childhood shaped by the deadly games of a turbulent court. Tragedy was a constant companion. His father, a beacon of Roman valor, died under suspicious circumstances. His mother and brothers, viewed as threats during Emperor Tiberius's cautious rule, faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. Yet young Gaius endured, a charismatic survivor, a charismatic figure, with a theatrical figure with a gaze that unsettled even seasoned senators. Tiberius reportedly described him as a serpent raised in the heart of Rome, words that now echo with eerie foresight. The year is 37 A.D. Tiberius is dead, perhaps by natural causes, perhaps not. The Senate, weary from his shadowy reign, welcomes Caligula with open arms and hopeful hearts. At just 24, he inherits an empire that stretches from Britannia's fog-laced cliffs to Egypt's sun-drenched temples. The power is absolute and intoxicating. Caligula's early reign is unexpectedly promising. He reverses repressive edicts, frees political prisoners, and rewards the Praetorian Guard and civic leaders, solidifying their support. In a rare act of transparency, he even publicly discloses the empire's finances. Rome rejoices. The grandeur intensifies. Chariot races electrify the Circus Maximus, gladiator contests thrill the amphitheaters, and theaters roar with new life. Caligula, clad in gold and deep crimson, orchestrates it all, a maestro on Rome's grandest stage. The people adore him. Foreign envoys are dazzled by his charm. The Senate dares to hope for a rebirth of Roman greatness. But beneath the jubilation, unease takes root. Some begin to notice his fixation on the arena, how his eyes linger on the fallen. He watches contests with unsettling focus, as if absorbing their final moments. Servants whisper of his nighttime strolls through the Colosseum, alone and deep in thought. He walks where others fought, retracing their steps. His laughter in public is loud, but when the crowds disperse, a silence clings to him. Still, the golden mask holds, for now. Caligula restores neglected temples, repairs aqueducts, and opens massive public works, putting thousands to work and breathing energy into Rome's weary heart. His popularity surges. His image, radiant, almost divine, is engraved in coin and statue. Yet, whispers grow. Palace aides speak of increasing paranoia. Guards are stationed even at his bedside. Some claim he sits alone in the arena, long after dark, staring into the blood-stained sand. His fascination with violence no longer seems theatrical, but personal. Something inside him is shifting. And so, this golden dawn, so bright, so hopeful, may not mark a new age at all. It is the final glimmer before a descent. The cheers of the masses fade, and Caligula, enthralled by unchecked power, now stands at the edge of transformation. The curtain is rising, but the tragedy has only just begun. 8 months. 8 short months of golden promise. And then, the crash. Caligula, the radiant emperor, the darling of Rome, collapses. A fever takes hold, shaking him to his core. The historical accounts are vague, conflicting. Some whisper of epilepsy, others of meningitis, still others of poison. The cause is irrelevant. The effect is cataclysmic. The vibrant, adored emperor lies deathly ill. Rome holds its breath. Prayers rise from every temple. Sacrifices are offered. Even hardened soldiers weep. The fear of losing Caligula is overwhelming. He's confined to his chambers, delirious, raving in the grip of a relentless fever. Torchlight flickers through the palace windows as doctors and priests work feverishly, their efforts seemingly futile. The people cry out to the gods, "Spare him!" And the gods, it seems, listen. Caligula recovers. But the man who emerges from that sickness is not the man who went in. The spark is gone. The warmth has vanished. Something has fundamentally, irrevocably changed. His voice, once warm and theatrical, is now harsh, grating. His gait is stiff. His smile no longer reaches his eyes. And his gaze is cold, distant, lingering far too long. At first, the court tries to ignore it. After all, he nearly died. Surely it's just lingering effects, a temporary setback. But the unsettling behaviors persist, then worsen. Sudden outbursts of rage become commonplace. Servants are berated for imagined offenses. Senators accused of treasonous whispers, then beaten, imprisoned, executed. He begins conversing with statues, muttering to marble busts as if they answer. At night, palace guards report strange sounds, guttural laughter echoing through the empty halls, the emperor pacing restlessly, endlessly. What was once considered eccentric is now undeniably deranged. Caligula no longer tolerates dissent, not even hesitation. A senator who pauses before bowing is summarily executed, his property seized, his family exiled. The message is clear: fear me or die. He declares mourning periods for personal losses, during which it becomes a capital offense to laugh, to bathe, even to dine with family. One unfortunate senator, caught smiling during dinner, is stabbed before dessert. Even dreams are no longer safe. Caligula claims that a respected senator, Marcus Junius Silanus, appeared threatening in a dream. The man is immediately executed. Caligula declares that the gods have warned him, and to disobey divine instruction is treason. Rome had prayed for their emperor's life. Now, they pray for his death. The transformation is so profound that historians later speculate that the illness caused brain damage, shattering his ability to empathize, to reason, to distinguish cruelty from justice. Whether physical, psychological, or simply the intoxicating effect of absolute power, the change is undeniable. The Golden Emperor is gone. In his place stands a tyrant, unstable, volatile, and utterly cruel. And Rome, still clinging to the illusion of celebration, has not yet grasped the depth of the abyss into which they are about to fall. What began as erratic behavior soon metastasized into full-blown tyranny. Caligula no longer merely demanded obedience, he craved absolute submission. His obsession with control seeped into every corner of Roman life. Rituals of humiliation became commonplace. Senators, once the pillars of Roman society, were forced to crawl on their knees before him, to kiss his feet, to avert their eyes, and to praise him not only as emperor, but as a living god. Any hesitation, any stumble in their words, any sign of discomfort was noted and remembered. Their names would later appear on execution lists. Their homes would be raided, and their families stripped of their rank and wealth. Caligula reveled in these displays of power, orchestrating them with theatrical precision. At banquets, he would begin the evening jovially, sharing stories and laughter while drinking generously. Then, without warning, he might turn on a guest, accusing them of some imagined insult.
In front of the entire gathering, the unfortunate individual would be seized and dragged away to be executed that very night. Even laughter became a dangerous game. Following the death of his sister Drusilla, Caligula declared a period of mourning, decreeing that no one in the city was to smile, bathe, or dine with others. Breaking these decrees, even unknowingly, was considered an act of treason. Rome became a city of whispers, where fear hung heavy in the air. In this climate of terror, Caligula's cruelty intensified. He delighted in inventing new and imaginative punishments, both physical and psychological. A wealthy noble who failed to flatter him sufficiently was forced to auction off his estate, with the proceeds going to fund yet more statues of Caligula. A poet who dared to mock the emperor in private had his tongue cut out before being crucified, his crime revealed by a slave who overheard him. The line between public rule and private madness blurred beyond recognition. Caligula now claimed to speak directly with the gods, erecting golden statues of himself inside the most sacred Roman temples. He demanded that citizens offer sacrifices not to Jupiter or Mars, but to Caligula. Foreign ambassadors were forced to bow before his image or face imprisonment. He even changed the calendar, naming months after himself and days solely to his supposed divinity. He declared that he held the power of life and death in his hands, his thumb up or down becoming a symbol of divine judgment. In private, he boasted that he could have anyone killed simply because it pleases me. Those who had once prayed for his survival now flinched at the sound of his voice. Rome was no longer ruled, it was held hostage. A transformation once whispered in back rooms had now boldly stepped into the streets. The young emperor who walked among the people had been consumed by the very power they had bestowed upon him. He was no longer a monster, a self-proclaimed god among mortals. With each passing week, Caligula's transformation deepened, not just into a tyrant, but into a deity in his own mind.
He no longer saw himself as merely the emperor of Rome. He was Jupiter reborn, Apollo made flesh, Neptune walking among mortals, and he demanded to be worshipped as such. The temples of Rome, once reserved for the pantheon of gods, were remodeled in his image. Massive golden statues of Caligula were erected beside those of Jupiter and Mars. Sacred altars were rededicated to Divus Caligula. Priests were ordered to conduct rites in his name. When foreign envoys arrived, they were no longer asked to address the emperor. They were expected to kneel before his statue and offer sacrifices, as if standing before a god. Hesitation meant imprisonment, or worse. The line between religion and tyranny vanished, every act of worship becoming a loyalty test. Every prayer, every offering, every coin dropped into a temple basin becoming a performance of submission. Citizens lit incense not out of faith, but out of fear. Rumors spread of spies planted in the crowds, watching for hesitation, listening for murmured doubts. A citizen who failed to bow low enough before Caligula's likeness might find their home confiscated the next day, or their family simply disappear. But it wasn't enough. Caligula wanted to be worshipped not only in temples, but in bedrooms, dining halls, and the very minds of his people. He replaced traditional religious festivals with celebrations of his own divine glory. A feast day commemorated the day he claimed to have defeated a thunderstorm by shouting louder than it. Months were renamed in his honor. Roman calendars were rewritten with entire weeks devoted to his name. And then came the communion rites. Caligula began to conduct perverse ceremonies that fused worship with degradation. In one infamous instance, he forced nobles to kiss his feet and offer praise while naked, standing before his statue. Women were made to refer to him as divine husband, and men were commanded to call him father of the gods. During dinners, he would interrupt the entertainment and demand spontaneous prayers, refusing to continue until he deemed the flattery sufficient. One night, he stood atop the Capitoline steps and shouted at the sky, cursing Jupiter himself for taking too long to strike him down.
When no thunder came, he declared it proof that he had surpassed the gods. Even his inner circle began to crack under the pressure. Ministers, priests, and generals who once praised him now did so with trembling voices. Behind closed doors, even they whispered that their emperor was no longer sane. But they whispered quietly, because Rome was no longer ruled by a man, nor even by a monster. It was ruled by a god who demanded obedience not through love, but through terror. And in this twisted religion, there was no room for unbelievers. What began as divine self-worship quickly devolved into something far more grotesque. In Caligula's twisted mind, sex, power, and divinity became inextricably intertwined. The imperial palace was no longer a seat of government, it was a theater of degradation. He hosted regular orgies, not in secret chambers, but in full public view within the palace halls. Senators, generals, and nobles were summoned not to advise the emperor, but to watch, to participate under threat of execution. Husbands watched as their wives were stripped and offered up to Caligula like cattle. The emperor would disappear with them, returning minutes later to offer cold critiques of their performance in front of the entire court. No one was safe from his gaze. Women were treated as ceremonial offerings, and men as disposable tools. He selected victims with eerie casualness, sometimes plucking them from the street, other times during formal dinners. He fondled noblewomen openly, regardless of protest or the presence of their families. Resistance was considered treason. But the horror did not stop with strangers. Caligula's perversions reached inward into his own bloodline. His relationship with his beloved sister Drusilla had long raised whispers in the palace. He referred to her as his wife, brought her everywhere, even seated her beside him at Senate functions. When she died suddenly, the emperor's grief was unhinged. He declared her a goddess, demanded that temples be built in her name, and instituted mourning laws that banned joy in any form. Yet it wasn't just Drusilla. Historical accounts, including those of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, suggest he also violated his other sisters, Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla. He would grope them at public banquets, parade them as symbols of divine femininity, then use them as sexual favors for foreign ambassadors or political allies. They were no longer women, they were sacred instruments in the emperor's theater of control. These acts were not merely perverse, they were ritualized. Caligula claimed his sexual deeds were sacred rites demanded by the gods. He invented new ceremonies where women were forced to worship his genitals as holy relics. Men were made to perform degrading acts in mock religious communion with the divine emperor. Refusal was not an option. In his private temple palace, screams echoed as participants were violated under the guise of sacred duty. The line between religion and rape had been obliterated. The emperor called it divinity, Rome called it madness, but no one dared speak aloud. Those who emerged from these ceremonies, if they emerged at all, were forever changed. Many wept in silence, others vanished altogether, and the rest wore hollow smiles, pretending that what had happened was holy, lest they be next. This was no longer just tyranny, it was theological terrorism. Caligula did not simply demand obedience, he demanded the body, the soul, the belief that what he did, no matter how violent or vile, was not only acceptable, but sacred. By now, Caligula's palace was no longer a center of governance, it was a labyrinth of fear. Every corridor whispered of executions, every banquet carried the stench of blood, and every subject, from noble to servant, lived one breath away from ruin. Caligula's mood swings became legendary. He could enter a room smiling, deliver a charming anecdote, then suddenly order someone's death for interrupting him with a cough. At feasts, musicians played soft lyres while guests dined, never knowing if the evening would end in laughter or screams. No law protected anyone from his wrath. He was the law, and the law had grown fangs. He turned punishment into spectacle, devising new methods of execution not just to kill, but to humiliate. One senator was stripped naked, covered in honey, and tied to a stake in the palace gardens. Slaves released insects while Caligula watched from a shaded pavilion, sipping wine as the man was slowly devoured. Another noble was sewn into the skin of a dead donkey and left to rot in the sun. his punishment for having mocked the emperor's voice in private. The palace kitchens became chambers of horror. Victims were brought in not for food, but as part of a perverse game. Caligula served dishes made to resemble human flesh, telling his guests it was the meat of traitors. Whether the food was real or not no longer mattered, the effect was the same. No one ate. Everyone feared vomiting, because even that might offend the emperor. The servants developed elaborate systems of signals to warn each other of the emperor's mood. A glance from a guard, a tilt of a lamp, a missing wine cup, these meant the air was poisonous, that today's breath might be the last. Yet even with these precautions, many vanished. His sleeping quarters were lined with torture devices, racks, knives, pincers placed beside priceless artworks and scrolls. The juxtaposition was intentional, beauty beside horror, grace beside agony. It reminded everyone that even culture bowed before him. At dawn, he held public audiences. Citizens gathered with petitions and pleas, hoping for justice. Some were granted small favors, an inheritance returned, a lost son pardoned. Others were executed on the spot. Why? Perhaps their voice annoyed him. Perhaps they wore the wrong shoes. Perhaps he simply didn't like their face. Guards dragged bodies through the same halls that once echoed with music. And still, the Senate did nothing, frozen in fear. Statues were built, temples dedicated. All the while, the city bled beneath the gold. This was no longer governance, it was survival. And in the world Caligula had built, survival was a privilege purchased daily with obedience, silence, and luck. By now, Caligula's palace was no longer a center of governance, it was a labyrinth of fear. Every corridor whispered of executions, every banquet carried the stench of blood, and every subject, from noble to servant, lived one breath away from ruin. Caligula's mood swings became legendary. He could enter a room smiling, deliver a charming anecdote, then suddenly order someone's death for interrupting him with a cough. At feasts, musicians played soft lyres while guests dined, never knowing if the evening would end in laughter or screams. No law protected anyone from his wrath. He was the law, and the law had grown fangs. He turned punishment into spectacle, devising new methods of execution not just to kill, but to humiliate. One senator was stripped naked, covered in honey, and tied to a stake in the palace gardens. Slaves released insects while Caligula watched from a shaded pavilion, sipping wine as the man was slowly devoured. Another noble was sewn into the skin of a dead donkey and left to rot in the sun, his punishment for having mocked the emperor's voice in private. The palace kitchens became chambers of horror. Victims were brought in not for food, but as part of a perverse game. Caligula once served dishes made to resemble human flesh, telling his guests it was the meat of traitors. Whether the food was real or not no longer mattered, the effect was the same. No one ate. Everyone feared vomiting, because even that might offend the emperor. The servants developed elaborate systems of signals to warn each other of the emperor's mood.
Caligula's reign was not only soaked in blood, it was fueled by gold. And even in the vast Roman Empire, gold eventually runs out. Tiberius, though feared, had been frugal. By the time of his death, the imperial treasury overflowed with reserves, some 2.7 billion sesterces. Caligula burned through it all within a single year. The orgies, the games, the feasts, the statues of himself in gold and ivory, they came at a terrible cost. And when the money ran dry, the emperor turned to the people. Rome would pay for its emperor's fantasies. First, he sold state properties and seized inheritances. Families who had loyally served Rome for generations awoke to find their estates confiscated, their homes raided. Caligula declared that the wealth of the people belongs to the gods, and as I am a god, their wealth belongs to me. But this was only the beginning. He began auctioning off positions in the Senate and Praetorian Guard to the highest bidder. Justice was bought and sold. Trials became games of who could bribe the emperor faster. Caligula even turned the palace into a brothel, forcing noblewomen to serve as entertainers for foreign guests and collecting every coin spent. Then came the taxes. He taxed marriages and divorces, lawsuits, markets, doors, windows, prostitution, gambling, and inheritances.
One decree required citizens to pay for the privilege of remaining silent during his speeches. Another charged people simply for walking in the street near his palace. No absurdity was too great. When questioned, Caligula smiled and said, "I only take what is already mine." Desperation made him dangerous. He published secret lists of wealthy citizens and had them executed on fabricated charges. Their assets were seized immediately. It became a crime to appear rich. Wearing fine clothes, owning too much land, or hosting a banquet could result in an accusation of treason. Rome grew quiet, not just from fear, but from ruin. Merchants fled, farmers buried their coins, and the middle class collapsed. The once vibrant city, with its marble temples and bustling markets, dimmed beneath the weight of imperial greed. Caligula's face, chiseled in stone and gilded on coins, was everywhere. But the economy beneath that mask was dying. And yet, he built more. He ordered the construction of impossible monuments. A floating bridge across the Bay of Naples, built just so he could ride his horse over water. Temples without roofs, statues that rivaled mountains. While his people starved, he declared that he was building a new Rome, worthy of a god. The emperor's madness was now institutionalized. His economic policies were not just foolish, they were predatory. And as the empire bled coin by coin, Caligula smiled, drank, and dreamed of marble cities that would never be finished. Because to a man who believed he was divine, debt, suffering, and famine were not problems, they were offerings. When power becomes unchecked and reality bends to the will of one man, even the sea itself may be declared an enemy. By the time Caligula launched his most absurd campaign, Rome had already witnessed more than it could comprehend. But this, a war against Neptune, god of the sea, would surpass all reason. It began with rumors. The emperor, dissatisfied with mortal conquests, declared that Rome had no worthy enemies left on land. "The gods are my equals now," he said, "and some of them must be punished." His target, Neptune, the divine ruler of the oceans. His offense? Sending storms that delayed Caligula's arrival in Gaul. So he prepared for war. Thousands of Roman soldiers were marched to the northern coast of Gaul, not to face men or kingdoms, but to wage battle against the sea itself. Armor gleamed beneath gray skies, standards fluttered, and orders were shouted. But there was no enemy, no resistance, only waves. Caligula raised his sword, pointed it toward the ocean, and screamed a battle cry. Trumpets blared. Soldiers, stunned and silent, watched as he commanded them to attack the surf. Spears were thrown into the tide, swords swung at empty air. The waves, of course, did not bleed. And yet, the emperor declared victory. He ordered his men to collect seashells from the beach, calling them spoils of war from the conquered ocean. Soldiers crawled along the shore, filling baskets with shells, as officers took inventory. Caligula stood watching proudly, convinced of his divine triumph. Then came the trophies. Dozens of chariots were loaded with the shells, paraded back to Rome as if they were weapons stripped from a fallen enemy. He sent proclamations to the Senate, demanding they honor him with a triumph, a victory parade through the capital. "The sea has surrendered," he wrote. "Neptune is defeated." The Senate, terrified as always, complied. A mock triumph was held. Caligula rode a gilded chariot through the streets, wearing a crown of coral and holding a trident. Behind him, soldiers marched solemnly, holding baskets of seashells like captured treasure. The citizens clapped weakly. Some wept in confusion, others looked away, afraid to question what they saw. But the legions, hardened veterans of real wars, were not fooled. They had spilled blood in Germania, in Parthia, in Britannia. Now they were collecting shells for a madman who believed himself a god. The chain of respect that bound emperor to army was cracking, and in the eyes of many commanders, it had already snapped. Caligula believed he had conquered the sea, but in truth, he had only drowned his empire deeper in humiliation. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, even the silence in Rome had grown heavy with dread. The palace that once echoed with music now swallowed sound. The Senate no longer debated, they obeyed. The legions no longer saluted, they endured. But beneath the obedience, something else stirred, a quiet desperation. The first to break was Cassius Chera, a veteran officer of the Praetorian Guard. He had served loyally under previous emperors, calm, disciplined, and unwavering. Caligula mocked him cruelly, calling him womanish, ridiculing his voice, and assigning him humiliating duties during public games. What had once been mere insult became poison. The proud soldier, stripped of his dignity before crowds, began to whisper, and others listened. The plot grew not from ideology, but necessity. Senators who had lost sons, officers who had been publicly shamed, equestrians bankrupted by imperial seizures, freedmen who feared the next execution would be their own. There was no formal council, only glances in corridors, coded gestures, and notes passed in the dark. Their bond was simple survival. Caligula had made it clear that no one was safe. He had accused senators based on dreams, ordered executions mid-banquet, and desecrated every sacred rite of the state. Even his Germanic bodyguards, once fiercely loyal, had begun to question his sanity. The gods had not struck him down, so now men would. The conspirators studied his habits with precision. They learned his routes, his schedules, his moods. The palace was a fortress, but every fortress has a blind spot. And Caligula, drunk on his own divinity, no longer feared assassination. He believed himself immortal, untouchable. They chose their moment carefully, the changing of the palace guard during a midday break in public festivities. At this hour, the emperor was known to pass through a narrow corridor beneath the palace, an old service route between the theater and his private quarters. It was dark, unwatched, enclosed, perfect. The plan was simple and brutal. Strike fast, strike without hesitation, strike where the gods could not see. And so, on that cold Roman afternoon, swords were sharpened, armor adjusted, and faces steeled. Cassius Chera and his fellow officers took their positions in the shadows. Every step they took was against the very empire they had sworn to protect. But they no longer saw Caligula as emperor. They saw a curse, a plague, and plagues must be purged. As Caligula rose from his seat in the theater to return to his chambers, laughing and mocking an actor for a bad performance, guards followed, courtiers bowed, and the sun shone. The corridor waited. What came next would change Rome forever. The corridor was narrow, the light dim. The marble walls that once reflected triumph now echoed only footsteps and breath. Caligula walked with a casual stride, flanked by a few attendants and bodyguards. He had just left the theater, amused by the failure of an actor he had mocked openly. His laughter still hung in the air, sharp and hollow. But in the shadows ahead, others waited. Cassius Chera and the conspirators stood still, blades hidden beneath cloaks, hands trembling with tension. It had to be quick, no speeches, no hesitation. This was not a duel, it was a cleansing. As Caligula stepped into the tightest bend of the passage, Chera stepped forward. "Do you remember me now, Caesar?" he said coldly. Caligula turned, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, just long enough. The first blow struck his neck, slicing deep. He staggered back, another blade plunged into his chest. He cried out, not in fear, but in fury. "I am still alive," he shouted, blood bubbling at his lips, as if defiance alone could ward off death. But he wasn't. More blades followed, silent, ruthless. Each conspirator took a turn, not out of necessity, but catharsis. Years of humiliation, grief, and terror poured out in steel. When it was over, the emperor lay twisted on the cold floor, his purple cloak soaked dark, his eyes, once wide with delusion, now staring at nothing. The god had bled. The silence that followed was almost holy. But outside